The granddaughter was ordered to be removed, but when she spoke in court, no one could believe what they heard. Lena sat on the old wooden porch steps, her legs swinging as she watched the sunset paint the sky in soft pinks and oranges. The warm breeze carried the scent of fresh lavender from her grandmother's garden, and for a moment, everything felt safe, familiar. "Come inside, sweetheart," Grandma Marjorie called from the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's getting late." Lena hopped up, running inside. The small house smelled of cinnamon and old books, a scent that reminded her of comfort, of home. Since her parents had passed away, it had been just the two of them, and Lena couldn't imagine life any other way. But that evening, everything changed. Her uncles, Raymond and Eleanor, arrived unannounced. They barely looked at Lena as they stepped inside, their expressions stiff. Grandma Marjorie greeted them politely, but Lena could sense something was wrong. They sat in the living room, speaking in hushed tones, while Lena sat at the dining table, pretending to do her homework. She couldn't make out every word, but she caught enough. "She can't take care of herself anymore," Raymond said, his voice low. "It's time to make a decision." Eleanor sighed. "She forgets things, Ray. What if she leaves the stove on? What if she wanders off?" "I do not," Marjorie interrupted, her voice firm. "I am perfectly capable of taking care of myself." "And of Lena." "But for how long?" Eleanor countered, feigning concern. "We only want what's best for you." Lena's stomach twisted. She knew her grandmother better than anyone. Sure, sometimes she forgot where she left her glasses, but she wasn't incapable. She wasn't helpless. Then Raymond said something that made Lena's blood run cold. "The court hearing is next week. We've already filed for guardianship. Once it's official, we'll move you into a facility where you'll be taken care of." Lena's heart pounded. This wasn't about safety. This wasn't about care. This was about money. And she was the only one who knew the truth. Lena lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. The soft ticking of the old clock in the hallway was the only sound in the house, but her mind was anything but quiet. Her uncles were trying to take Grandma Marjorie away. They were going to put her in a facility, make it seem like she was too weak, too forgetful. But Lena knew the truth. This wasn't about her grandmother's health. It was about control. About money. She turned onto her side, clenching her blanket in her small fists. Grandma had always told her to be brave, to stand up for what was right. But how could she? She was just a kid. No one would listen to her. Still, she couldn't just do nothing. The next morning, she decided to test her theory. "Grandma," she asked over breakfast, keeping her voice light, "where do you keep your important papers?" Marjorie frowned, stirring her tea. "Why do you ask, sweetheart?" Lena shrugged, pretending to be uninterested. "Just curious." Her grandmother smiled and tapped Lena's nose playfully. "Well, if you must know, I keep them in the sewing box in my closet. But there's nothing interesting there, just old receipts and letters." Lena's heart skipped a beat. The sewing box. Later that day, when Marjorie was outside tending to the garden, Lena slipped into the bedroom. The sewing box sat neatly on the shelf in the closet, just as her grandmother had said. She opened it, sifting through bits of fabric and spools of thread until her fingers brushed against something different, an envelope. She pulled it out carefully, unfolding the paper inside. Her eyes widened as she read the shaky handwriting. "I, Marjorie Whitmore, do not wish to be placed under guardianship. I am of sound mind and capable of making my own decisions." Lena's hands trembled. This was proof. If her grandmother had already written this, it meant she had suspected what was coming. Maybe she had even been pressured to sign something else, something she didn't agree with. Before Lena could think about what to do next, the front door creaked open. "Lena!" Eleanor's voice echoed through the house. Lena's stomach dropped. She quickly folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket. She had to act normal. She couldn't let them know what she had found. Not yet. Lena's hands felt clammy as she walked down the stairs, forcing a smile when she saw Eleanor in the kitchen. "There you are," her aunt said, stirring sugar into her tea. "What have you been up to?" Lena shrugged, keeping her voice casual. "Just playing in my room." Eleanor studied her for a moment before nodding. "Well, go wash up. We have some papers to go over with your grandmother." Lena's stomach twisted. Papers. She knew without a doubt that they were trying to force Grandma Marjorie into signing something, probably something legal that would make it impossible for her to fight back. She had to stop them. That night, when the house was silent, Lena pulled out the letter she had found. She read it over and over, the words sinking in. This paper proved that her grandmother was of sound mind. If only she could get someone to see it before it was too late. But who would believe her? Her teacher? No, this was a legal issue. The police? Would they even listen to a kid? Then it hit her. The court. If there was a hearing coming up, that meant a judge would be deciding what happened to her grandmother. Maybe, just maybe, if she could show the letter to the judge before Raymond and Eleanor could take control, Grandma would have a chance. Lena's heart pounded. It was a long shot, but it was the only idea she had. Now, she just had to figure out how to get into that courtroom. Lena barely slept that night. Her mind kept spinning, replaying every word she had overheard, every worried glance her grandmother had given. The court hearing was soon. She didn't know exactly when, but if she didn't act fast, it might be too late. At breakfast, Eleanor and Raymond sat across from Grandma Marjorie, placing documents in front of her. "These are just formalities," Raymond said, sliding a pen toward her. "It'll make everything easier, Marjorie." Lena clenched her fists under the table. Easier for them, not for Grandma. Marjorie hesitated, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched the paper. "Do I have to sign this?" she asked softly. Eleanor sighed dramatically. "Of course not, Marjorie. But refusing won't change the fact that the court will see you as incapable. This is just making it official." Lena's heart pounded. This was manipulation. She had to do something. "Grandma," she blurted out before she could stop herself. "You don't have to sign anything you don't want to." Eleanor's eyes snapped to her. "Lena, this is an adult conversation." Lena swallowed hard. "She has a right to choose, doesn't she?" Marjorie looked at Lena, her expression conflicted. Raymond exhaled sharply. "This isn't up for debate. The court will decide soon enough." That was it. The confirmation Lena needed. She had no time to waste. That afternoon, when Raymond and Eleanor went into town for errands, Lena made her move. She grabbed the letter she had found and tucked it securely into her pocket. Then she picked up the phone and dialed the courthouse. A woman answered. "County clerk's office. How can I help you?" Lena took a deep breath. "Hi. I need to know when a hearing is scheduled for Marjorie Whitmore. Are you a relative?" Lena hesitated. "I'm her granddaughter." The woman paused. One moment. Lena's heart pounded as she waited. Then the answer came. "Her guardianship hearing is tomorrow morning." Tomorrow. She had less than 24 hours to get inside that courtroom. Lena hung up the phone, her heart racing. Tomorrow. She had one chance to stop this. She turned to see Grandma Marjorie sitting by the window, staring out at the garden. The late afternoon light made her silver hair glow, but there was something distant in her expression, like she already knew she was losing everything. Lena couldn't let that happen. She walked over and sat beside her. "Grandma, do you want to stay here? In our house?" Marjorie blinked and turned to her. "Of course I do, sweetheart. This is my home." Lena took her grandmother's hands in hers. "Then we have to fight. I found your letter, the one where you said you don't want guardianship. We have to show it to the judge." Marjorie's eyes widened. "Oh, Lena, I wrote that because I was afraid. But the court won't listen to me." Lena squeezed her hands tighter. "Then they'll have to listen to me." Marjorie looked uncertain, but before she could respond, the front door opened. Eleanor and Raymond were back. Lena quickly slipped the letter back into her pocket, forcing herself to stay calm. "Everything all right?" Eleanor asked, eyeing them suspiciously. Lena nodded. "Just keeping Grandma company." Raymond dropped a bag of groceries onto the counter. "Well, you should get to bed soon. Big day tomorrow." Lena's stomach twisted. They were so sure they had already won. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. How was she supposed to get to the courthouse? They would never let her come along willingly. Then an idea struck her. Mrs. Calloway. She slipped quietly out of bed, crept to the hallway phone, and dialed a neighbor's number. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Mrs. Calloway, it's me." "Lena." Lena? What's wrong, dear? I need your help. A pause. Then, come to my house at sunrise. Relief flooded through Lena. She wasn't alone in this. Now, all she had to do was get out of the house without being caught. Lena woke before dawn, her heart pounding as she sat up in bed. The house was still silent. Raymond and Eleanor were probably still asleep. This was her only chance. She dressed quickly and took the letter from her pocket, holding it tightly. This was her proof. Her only chance to save Grandma. Carefully, she opened her bedroom door and peeked down the hallway. No sign of her aunt or uncle. Holding her breath, Lena tiptoed across the soft carpet, moving slowly down the stairs, careful not to make a sound. When she reached the front door, her heart dropped. The lock. They always locked the door at night. Lena swallowed hard. She couldn't turn back now. Looking around, her eyes landed on the small hallway table, where Eleanor always left the house keys. Biting her lip, she stretched out her hand and grabbed the keyring, gripping the cold metal carefully to keep it from jingling. She slid the key into the lock, barely breathing as the latch released with a faint click. Nothing stirred. Without hesitating, Lena opened the door and slipped outside, pulling it shut behind her. The crisp morning air wrapped around her as she ran. The first rays of sunlight were creeping over the horizon when she reached Mrs. Calloway's house. The elderly woman was already waiting on the porch, coat and handbag in hand. "Oh, sweetheart," Mrs. Calloway said gently. "You really are willing to fight for your grandmother, aren't you?" Lena nodded, trying to catch her breath. "I have to get to the courthouse." Mrs. Calloway looked at her for a long moment, then opened the car door. "Then let's go." Lena climbed in quickly, gripping the letter even tighter. The courthouse was her last hope. The car ride to the courthouse felt both too long and too short. Lena's hands trembled as she clutched the letter in her lap. What if they didn't let her in? What if the judge had already made a decision? Mrs. Calloway glanced at her from the driver's seat. "Are you sure about this, dear?" Lena nodded, her jaw set. "I have to be." When they pulled up to the courthouse, Lena barely waited for the car to stop before jumping out. The grand stone building loomed over her, its steps stretching up toward the massive wooden doors. Taking a deep breath, she ran up the stairs 2 at a time. Inside, the air was heavy with whispers and shuffling papers. Men in suits walked briskly through the halls, and the scent of polished wood filled Lena's nose. She spotted a directory on the wall. Guardianship Hearing, Room 302. Lena sprinted down the corridor, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She was almost there. Then a voice stopped her in her tracks. Well, well, look who decided to show up." Lena turned, her stomach twisting. Eleanor and Raymond stood at the end of the hall, their expressions frozen between surprise and anger. "You shouldn't be here," Eleanor hissed, stepping toward her. Raymond crossed his arms. "It's too late, Lena. The judge is already making his decision." Lena tightened her grip on the letter, not without hearing the truth. She turned and ran for the courtroom doors, ignoring Eleanor's sharp call behind her. She wasn't stopping. Not now. She reached the doors, pressed her small hands against them, and pushed. Inside, the judge was speaking. A lawyer was standing at a podium. And there, sitting quietly at a long table, was Grandma Marjorie. Lena took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I have something to say," she declared, her voice louder than she expected. The entire room fell silent. The judge raised an eyebrow, looking down at her over his glasses. "And you are?" Lena lifted the letter in her shaking hands. "I'm Marjorie Whitmore's granddaughter," she said, her voice steady now. "And I know the truth." For a moment, no one spoke. The courtroom was frozen, all eyes on Lena as she stood gripping the letter. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear herself think. The judge leaned forward. "Young lady, this is a formal proceeding. You can't just barge in." Lena swallowed hard but stood her ground. "Please, Your Honor. My grandmother doesn't need a guardian. My uncles are lying." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Raymond let out a sharp laugh. "She's just a child. She doesn't know what she's talking about." The judge frowned. "Step forward, Miss Whitmore." Lena's hands trembled as she walked to the front of the room, placing the letter carefully on the judge's desk. "My grandmother wrote this. She said she didn't want guardianship. She said she's capable of taking care of herself. The judge picked up the letter, adjusting his glasses as he read. The courtroom remained eerily silent. Raymond's lawyer cleared his throat. Your Honor, we don't know if that letter is authentic. And even if it is, Mrs. Whitmore may not have been in her right mind when she wrote it. Lena turned to look at her grandmother. Marjorie had been silent this whole time, her hands folded in her lap. But now she slowly lifted her head. I was completely in my right mind, she said, her voice steady. And I refuse to be forced into guardianship. Raymond shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Eleanor's face paled. The judge studied Marjorie for a long moment before turning back to Lena. How did you come across this letter? Lena hesitated. If she told him she had searched through her grandmother's things, would they dismiss it? But lying wouldn't help. I found it in her sewing box, she admitted. I was scared because my uncles kept talking about taking everything from her. And when I saw this letter, I knew I had to show you. The judge glanced at Raymond and Eleanor. Is this true? Were you planning to claim guardianship over Mrs. Whitmore's assets? Raymond cleared his throat. We only wanted what was best for her. The judge's eyes narrowed. That's not what I asked. Eleanor opened her mouth, but no words came out. The silence stretched. Then, finally, the judge sighed and placed the letter down. This court does not see sufficient evidence to declare Mrs. Whitmore incapacitated. The petition for guardianship is denied. A wave of relief crashed over Lena. Eleanor gasped. But this discussion is over, the judge said firmly. Mrs. Whitmore is free to manage her own affairs. Lena turned to her grandmother, and for the first time in weeks, she saw something familiar in her eyes, hope. As soon as the judge dismissed the court, Marjorie reached for Lena's hand, squeezing it tightly. My brave girl, she whispered. Lena smiled, tears prickling her eyes. I just did what you taught me, Grandma. Hand in hand, they walked out of the courthouse together, finally free. Epilogue, a new beginning. The sun was warm against Lena's skin as she sat on the porch steps, the same spot where everything had started. The garden smelled of fresh lavender, and inside, she could hear the soft clinking of teacups as Grandma Marjorie prepared their afternoon tea. Things were finally back to the way they should be. After the trial, Raymond and Eleanor had left town, humiliated and empty-handed. The judge had ordered an investigation into their attempts to manipulate Marjorie, and though they hadn't been arrested, they wouldn't be able to try again. Grandma was safe. Their home was safe. Lena, sweetheart, Marjorie called from the doorway, holding a tray with 2 steaming cups of tea. Come inside, dear. It's getting late. Lena smiled and stood, brushing the dust from her dress. As she stepped into the cozy house, she took a deep breath, letting the familiar scent of cinnamon and old books fill her lungs. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid. She was home.